everyone. It is a treat for those of us who teach law to find a topic that will bring in from across campus not only those who work in the humanities, but also those who work in fields like biology and atmospheric sciences and geography and geology and archaeology and natural resources and ecosystem stewardship and hydrology and environmental chemistry and so on. But I think that with the topic of frog murders, we have found it. So I want to begin by thanking Jackie Hadler and Carrie Mae Borich and Deans Virginia Vermillion and Leslie Wexler for overcoming enormous logistical hurdles to be able to locate this event in this room on this day at this time, and all the work that went into organizing the logistics and the details of the visit for our special guest. I want to thank Rob Carr for his generosity in giving up this room to this event during what is usually the time of his big contracts class. And I want to thank Tyler Hunter and Ben Mosenthal for their generous investment of expertise and time in helping us to ensure that the brand new technology that was just installed in this room will work flawlessly. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of today's lecture, the College of Law, the Program in Law and Philosophy, the Environmental Law Society, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Women in Gender and Global Perspectives Program, and the School of Earth, Society, and Environment. That's a heck of a partnership. So last January, I took a group of 16 students to Costa Rica for a study abroad course that was designed to sort of ground truth Costa Rica's widely publicized claim that it has both succeeded in achieving a steady pace of economic growth and adopted muscular enough environmental laws to guarantee the conservation of its extraordinary natural treasure. And we were unbelievably lucky because Mark Wainwright, who I had never met, agreed to be our guide throughout our 8 days of study and travel. And perhaps the most enviable and effortless strength that I found in Mark is his ability to command the respect and inspire the affection and instill the enthusiasm in students that is the hallmark of a truly gifted teacher. And so I thought it would be a particularly fitting tribute to him to have some of his students from that trip actually do the introduction of this hour and to thank him at the close. And so third-year law students Kenneth Wang and Alana Hart are going to kick us off with a quick introduction, and then Chris Williams and Jane Kim will close things out for us. Come on up.
Hi, my name is Kenneth Wang.
And I'm Alana Hart.
We're both 3Ls at the College of Law, and like Professor Hurt said, we had the opportunity last year to go to Costa Rica and really hang out with Mark. And I guess our introduction is really going to be short and sweet, and really focus on that not only is he this amazing guide, this amazing lecturer and expert in the field of amphibians and butterflies and all things to do with Costa Rica, but I mean, he's built this entire career there. He spent over 30 years inside the country doing conservation work, writing field guides, doing illustrations and scientific manuals. And the depth of his knowledge isn't just scientific, it extends to law, obviously. It extends to politics, to economics, to, I mean, everything you can think of. He has lived and breathed the experience and grown with Costa Rica's environmental laws over time. I thought I would start a very short thing because the flavor of our time in Costa Rica and with Mark is best exemplified through a small story, which for me was along the lines of when we did our night hike. One of our experiences there was to do a night hike inside one of the rainforests of Costa Rica. And I was afraid of bullet ants, and they really hurt, by the way. But at one moment during the night hike, Mark had us turn all of our torches, all of our lamps off, and just listen to the sounds that were coming in, and to identify all the individual noises we could hear. And we realized we were so busy listening to the sounds of our own voice, and me in particular, that that there was this huge symphony inside inside the rainforest, even at night when you think people are, well, decent people should be sleeping. And so hearing all of this and hearing this sort of, it was a revelation, not least in part to the fact that I crossed like this rickety wire bridge with like no guide in the darkness, and I could see like up the constellations. It was great. But essentially, the crux of this point is that suddenly you could hear everything, and you could hear all of these noises and all of this life happening around you that did not care for your purpose. It simply was. And you realize that this was, even though it sounded amazing, it was still an entirely fragile ecosystem, and something that we have to preserve for generations and generations. And so that was what I wanted to give out of my small introduction of what Mark was to us.
It's going to be tough to follow that one, but I want to really highlight what Mark does currently in Costa Rica. He is in his second term as president of the Children's Eternal Rainforest. This is, I think he manages over 56,000 acres in Costa Rica, and we got to visit it ourselves and walk through not 56,000 of it, but a good portion of it. And I will say Mark is an incredible field guide, an incredible lecturer, but so well respected by everybody that he encounters. And that's how you have to incorporate all the great traits in a community for them to respect you, and he really does. We were walking and he said, stop, like listen, and then he actually spotted a quetzal. We were maybe 20 minutes into our hike. Just has such an incredible understanding of the ecosystem, of the conservation efforts, and really is one with Costa Rica, and not just within where he works, but within the local communities. We were fortunate to visit a pineapple plantation and see people that are fighting against really some of the travesties that are going on. We got to visit very local, small rural areas in Costa Rica, and Mark somehow knows everyone, I swear. He made the trip, made me, I guess, understand and really appreciate a whole system, a whole field that I really didn't have a lot of information about, and enough cannot be said about his incredible qualifications. And it's going to be really interesting today. We're talking about amphibians and their mysterious decline, especially in Costa Rica, but even here in the United States, which I don't know about you all, but I was not aware of. So I, without further ado, cannot wait to introduce Mark Wainwright to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Well, I feel really good after that very generous introduction. The only problem is it's all downhill from here, but I'll just feel good for a few moments. So I really would like to preface today's talk by pointing out that I'm not a scientist. My entry point into tropical ecology was as an illustrator, and over time in Costa Rica that has grown into an interest in storytelling, and really that's what I consider myself to be primarily. But I have had the opportunity to be involved with research related to this issue of amphibian declines for almost the entire 30 years that I've been in Monteverde, Costa Rica, and have become fascinated with this theme. I worked for a local herpetologist, Dr. Alan Pounds, in the Tropical Science Center in the early 1990s doing census work. I have worked with, I don't know, a half dozen other scientific studies of this issue. And then in my other work, I also am involved with amphibians in different ways. I've been compiling digital collection of frog calls for about 25 years, and I've illustrated some guides. So it's been a part of my life, and it's just, as I hope we'll see in the short amount of time we have today, a fascinating theme that touches on all kinds of globally significant environmental issues. Because of that, it's a theme I often incorporate in the tropical ecology courses that I work with, including courses from this university. And we usually take several hours to cover this theme, and that already is a very reduced amount of time. This could be a semester course easily. As you'll see in today, we have even less, so I do what I can to cover some of the interesting ideas. I was aware before this trip was on the cards that this region was relevant in the discussion of this theme, and have made reference to do work here. But with this trip imminent, of course, one of the first things I did was to try to take a closer look at work done in this area. So I Googled amphibian declines, Illinois, and to my absolute horror, the first thing that popped up was this talk. So, I mean, a few days ago, I wasn't even sure how to pronounce the name of your state correctly, right? I mean, really, look, I had to Google that too. So, I apologize, if I have been billed by these fine students and Google as, this fountain of knowledge on Illinois amphibian declines. But I do have a fascinating story to tell you. And what I did find as I dug further is that this region, like Monteverde, where I'm from, plays a very important role. It has provided many pieces of the puzzle of this debate. So it's actually it's a very interesting connection between where I'm from and right here, as we'll see. Okay, let's start the story in Monteverde, Costa Rica. There is Costa Rica for those of you who are not familiar with its location. And the area that I live and work in is Monteverde, up in the northwest corner of Costa Rica, in the cloud forest, highland forest that's exposed to moisture-laden trade winds, which get blown from the Caribbean through the forest. And on the very tallest ridges of that region, there used to live a very strange toad, bright orange in the case of the males. It lived underground in tunnels created by trees rocking in the wind for almost all year, and it would come out for just 5 or 10 days with the onset of the first heavy rains for an orgy, basically, and then vanish. It was only discovered scientifically for the first time in the 1960s, so it was a relative novelty in the scientific world and quite famous. It was used in conservation efforts to protect habitat in Monteverde. In 1987, a researcher came down and counted them for the first time. Martha Crump, counted 1,500 of them at the main known breeding site in the cloud forest. She returned in 1988 to continue her work, and mysteriously, the toads did not appear. Only one appeared. That year was a Niño phenomenon year, which in Costa Rica means unusually warm, dry weather. So people imagined that perhaps that might have caused their absence. But in 1989, again, the toads failed to appear again, just a single toad. Another small group found at a more remote site. And as far as is known, that is the last time that the golden toad was seen. It quickly became clear that the golden toad was just one of a large number of amphibians that had either declined very dramatically or vanished altogether from our region. To be exact, out of a little over 50 species that one could reliably encounter each year in Monteverde, 25 in the year we did at the first census, 1990, were not encountered, gone, or maybe in numbers so small they were not detected, but still close to gone, and the other half were a tiny fraction of their former abundance. So just imagine if in this area, let's say, half the species of birds were to disappear altogether from one summer to the next, and the other half were to drop to 10 or 20% their former abundance. It would be a very dramatic event, and this was no less dramatic, even though we tend not to notice amphibians as much. It also quickly became clear that this strange phenomenon was not unique to Monteverde. Other areas were affected in a very similar fashion, sudden, massive declines, particularly in South America and Australia. And that's not the only thing that seemed to be affecting amphibians, because in other areas, there were more gradual declines, also taking a heavy toll on amphibians. Today, roughly a third of the world's amphibians are considered threatened. Sorry, hit the wrong button. And something like 168 species have vanished, or there's no known populations today. Numbers are pretty astounding. If we crudely lump the declines into different categories, the ones that took place in very quickly, very suddenly, like those that occurred in Monteverde, had a combination of traits generally. Those sudden crashes tended to affect aquatic species more than others, particularly river-dwelling ones. They tended to occur up in the mountains, specifically above about 800 meters in elevation. And thirdly, they often happened in areas independent of obvious habitat alteration. So what we mean by that is it didn't make any difference if a frog lived next to an urban area, next to a farm, or in the middle of a seemingly pristine, protected area. Yeah? There was no difference statistically. So that was one set we could lump, perhaps. And then in many areas, including here, the declines were less dramatic. Yeah? So I imagine some of you will recognize some of the species here. And just in my couple of days here, I have heard comments from, well, Tyler at the back there, for example, mentioned that this is one from Illinois that he used to see tons of growing up as a child and doesn't see anymore. These are the 9 species that your Endangered Species Protection Board lists currently as endangered, but the list of species that have declined is not restricted to the ones that happen to be in these categories. But as far as I'm aware, none of your species have vanished. Yeah? You've had some fairly sudden declines. I mean, some of the declines have happened. Your cricket frogs, I believe, have gone quite quickly from the northern part of the state, but none of them have had a one-year crash off a cliff, as happened in Monteverde and many other areas. So something else is happening here. Let's see, why should we care about these members of our community? Why are they important? Well, I'm just going to mention a couple of the most outstanding reasons. The first one, which I always like to emphasize, is that they're cool. And we talked about this yesterday. Yeah, and that's just the simplest way to express that. But they have a value of just being. They are the product, each and every one of them, of millions of years of selection, each one with 100 stories that goes into their design, the shape of their eyes and their mouth, what they eat, their skin toxins, you name it. Yeah? And that's our heritage. And above all, we should just embrace that and try to preserve it. Yeah? But of course, there's more practical considerations in the value of frogs too. That very fact that they are millions of years old as species means that each and every one of them carries a built-in resistance to all of the plights that they must have faced over their millions of years as a species on the planet, right? Which, in the case of amphibians, leads to usually an incredibly complex cocktail of bacteria, peptides, chemicals in the skin that provide them resistance against anything that might cause them harm. And we're just barely scratching the surface, just as plants do the same thing, on the potential medicinal value of those substances. But here's just a few examples. There's a tree frog in South America which has chemicals that act directly on the adenosine system in humans, providing potential pathway to look for treatments in Alzheimer's and clinical depression. There are patents on those substances. A toad toxin is used to lower heart rate during surgeries in China. This dart frog produces skin toxins that would serve as painkillers that are both more powerful than morphine, and because they're not opioid, would not create addiction or drowsiness, which would obviously be an enormous development. The slight problem with that one so far is that no one has been able to develop it in doses that are not lethal. This African clawed frog here has been used to develop a type of antibiotic, incredibly important, as you know, and also there's evidence it may help deal with different aspects of lung cancer and malaria. This one in the lower right here is just particularly bizarre. There's two species of gastric breeding frogs in Australia in which the female swallows her own eggs, and they hatch and develop in her stomach, and then she belches up the babies. And there's an enzyme that coats the eggs and the tadpoles, which cuts off the production of hydrochloric acid in her stomach, and that may have use in the treatment of stomach ulcers. Frogs are also surprisingly important in the food web because they are ectothermic, cold-blooded, if you like. They don't need much energy to subsist, not like an endothermic creature such as ourselves. They don't have a central heating bill, so to speak. They also are less constrained in size. We endothermic creatures cannot be smaller than about a hummingbird or a bat. Right? We can't eat enough to keep ourselves warm at that size, but frogs can. So that means two things. It means that a frog can subsist off a very small amount of food, and it can be very small. So in an area, let's say the size of this tabletop, you might have a frog that's able to subsist eating nothing but roly-polies. And you might have another frog in the same table that can subsist eating nothing but ants, let's say. And it turns out in studies done in several parts of the world that if you add up all of the frogs or salamanders, where they're more common, and you calculate the biomass of the amphibians and compare it to other vertebrate groups, amphibians often win. We would never imagine that because we notice birds and mammals more than them. But they are a surprisingly important component of ecosystems. And as such, of course, they play a surprisingly important role both as food for their predators and as predators for their prey. The final thing I'm going to mention today about why we should care, or why these members of our community are important, is that they're considered indicator species. Because so many aspects of their morphology and their life histories make them vulnerable to all sorts of different potential problems. Well, what are they indicating? That's what we're going to talk about. So if we were to make a list of suspects of this potential, or of this mass murder, who would we have on our list? I'm going to just open that question up to all of you. If you had a few years to look into this and no prior knowledge, what kinds of things or phenomena would be on your list of suspects? habitat loss. I'm going to just write these up right here. Uh-huh. Am I writing big enough for you to see? Uh-huh. Is that it? Uh-huh.
About 30 years ago, 35 years ago, the depletion of the ozone layer was identified as deleterious to amphibians.
Absolutely. We'll talk about all of these offerings, all these, yeah, in the back there. I'm sorry? Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I would expand the bottom of this to include microorganisms.
Well, I might put them under here.
Loss of genetic variety.
Uh-huh.
All of that is caused by us. Competition. Can you say something like a tipping point? I feel like most things are really bad with the population.
This is getting too low for some of you to read, isn't it? So I'll come over here.
I don't know how to say it, but like food pollution, if insects are being contaminated in some way or eating it.
Sure. All right, well, that should keep us entertained for a while. Let's go through this list, and then we'll see. Do you want to add one?
I'm thinking about chronic wasting disease, which actually isn't a disease, as you probably know, but it really is a kind of protein that gets into the body. And if we can drop that, though, forget it.
Well, if it becomes relevant to our discussion, you can bring it up again, and then we'll have a look. Well, let's take a look at these things that you suggested. Let's start with habitat loss. See, I read your mind. It was the first one on the slide. Needless to say, the degree to which habitat has changed, both in Costa Rica and in Illinois, is massive. Just look at those maps, and there is, in a hotly debated series of issues, as we'll see, there's one thing that every single publication agrees on, and that is that the single most important cause of amphibian declines is habitat loss, for obvious reasons. Less obvious, though, is that not only does habitat loss affect, clearly, if you're a forest living here and your prairie is replaced with a cornfield, that's a tough thing to deal with. But what's less obvious, maybe, is that the remaining fragments of appropriate habitat are also changed by being isolated, right? Because when you're isolated, you're more vulnerable to just about everything on our list, right? So it's not just habitat loss directly, yeah, but the impact it has on the neighboring remaining protected areas, and we should bear that in mind. Let's see. Competition. There's a few things you could put under that category, but one obvious one is invasive species. Yeah? What do we mean by invasive species? We mean non-native things coming into an ecosystem that's not adjusted to their presence and having disproportionate impact on native species. And there are tons of examples of invasive species that have impacted frog populations. Here are 4 examples. Trout in California have affected both yellow-legged and red-legged frogs. They eat the eggs, they eat the tadpoles, and they also can bring disease that affects the frogs. The American bullfrog is native in this region, but not to western US. And likewise, it also eats eggs, eats tadpoles, it eats adult frogs as well, and can bring disease. The cane toad, one of the most famous international examples of an introduced species, was introduced by us to Australia and other areas in Australia, supposedly to control a pest on sugarcane, hence the name, but has made itself very at home there where the family's not native. It's a very toxic species, and it has romped around ever since, the 1930s roughly, eating native frogs. Or an example from Florida, the mecca of invasive species. We could pick lots of examples from there, but let's pick the Cuban tree frog, which has competed with native species. It's native to islands in the Caribbean, Cuba and others, and has moved its way steadily up through Florida and beyond, and it also eats native species and presents other problems too. It even affects, for example, the acoustic behavior of some species, according to some studies. And it's not just frogs or even animals that are potentially problematic invasive species. Here's a study from here, from Illinois, looking at potential effects of a non-native plant that I imagine some of you are very familiar with. European buckthorn is a problem for lots of reasons. It changes leaf litter dynamics as the leaves decompose very fast because of their nutrient content, and it also shades out native ground cover, so that both of those things contribute to a change in leaf litter composition and depth, which is critical. It's where the frogs live. It's where their food lives. So any change in that is likely going to affect frogs. It's quite toxic. Almost nothing here eats it. Its fruits are full of laxatives, which is where it gets the name cathartica. Yeah. So birds will eat them. Sometimes they die. At the very least, they will undergo catharsis and drop the seeds somewhere and thus dispose the plant. But the thing this study looked at was that the plant produces a byproduct, amodin, which is toxic. And this study looked at its effect on the western chorus frog and found that it affects the eggs and the tadpoles of that species. So how much that has actually affected populations here is not known, but given how prevalent this plant is in this area, it's certainly one thing that would be on people's radar in this area. Okay. Yes, ozone. So, as you pointed out, the ozone issue raised its ugly head right through the same window of time when many of the worst declines took place. Yeah. For those of you who are not familiar with this issue, scientists warned in the 1970s that CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons used in aerosol cans and air conditioning units, would affect the ozone. Starting around 1980, scientists started to see that that was in fact happening. And the so-called hole in the ozone, which is just the thinnest part over Antarctica, grew at a very alarming rate through the early 1980s, enough to spook every single member of the United Nations to sign an agreement which came into effect in 1989, called the Montreal Protocol, to limit the use of CFCs. And since then, CFC levels have peaked and leveled, and this very optimistic report came out last year that predicts a return to normal over the next few decades at different rates, depending on where you are in the world. But still, it's clearly an issue that should be looked at, and people have. And there's abundant evidence that excessive levels of UV can affect amphibians, particularly the eggs, because they don't have shells. This particular study looked at a very interesting combination of factors that might have been at play in the decline of two species in the Cascade Mountains, the Cascade frog and the western toad. And these researchers presented evidence that a combination of El Nino, drier weather, and UV and a fungus was killing the eggs of these species. Specifically, they hypothesized that in El Nino drier years, the depth of the water where these species lay their eggs is less, and therefore the eggs are more exposed to UV, making them more vulnerable to this fungus. In general, however, UV does not seem like a great explanation for a lot of the declines. You need incredibly high levels of UV to outright kill adult frogs. And although those two species live above the tree line, many species, like our tropical ones, live in areas where it's hard to imagine they would be exposed to very high levels of UV. So it might be a player in some areas, but it doesn't look like a good global explanation. Pollution. Let's talk about that. Well, both here and where I live, there's very obvious sources of pollution nearby. Agricultural areas here, corn, soy, bananas, and pineapples, where I'm from. Let's start in Costa Rica. The cloud forest, where the massive declines took place, is up here, and our big agricultural activity is down in the lowlands, over here. So one question one would have to resolve to point the finger at agricultural contamination in our area is, how do chemicals get from here to there? And this study here seemed to answer that. It does, in fact, the chemicals do, in fact, get carried in the wind. However, there are a couple of problems in pointing the finger at agricultural chemicals in our area. First of all, there have been no species disappearances down in the lowlands of Costa Rica where these chemicals are applied, which you would expect. And second, it's hard to explain a one-year crash of multiple species from chemicals. There may be an explanation, but no one has come forward with an exact mechanism for that. So it doesn't look like a good explanation there. That's really not the case, however, here. I'm just going to mention some of the potential chemical issues that have appeared from research done in this area. And there's just, again, like everything we're talking about, there's just a vast body of material on this. Let's start with nitrates, okay, which are used as fertilizers. There is use of nitrates, okay, in the US, and you can see, right, in the thick of that. Nitrates are known to affect amphibians in multiple ways, particularly larvae, the tadpoles and eggs, adults too. Here is a study. I don't know if you can read that little text. This is average nitrate concentrations in surface water. And the circles, okay, represent the degree of effect on amphibians. Okay, so the levels of nitrates in surface water throughout this region are easily enough to create problems for amphibians. Another issue that's received attention is frog deformities. Yeah? Someone mentioned that to me earlier today. Have any of you heard of that? I'm sure some of you have. One of the main causes of these deformities apparently are these parasitic worms, trematode worms, and they have received some interesting attention. And they have been linked in different ways to agricultural chemicals. It's not because an agricultural chemical, drop of chemical lands on the frog and it sprouts 3 limbs. It's more indirect. For example, this study presented evidence that fertilizers were behind this problem. By encouraging the growth of algae in aquatic ecosystems here, through that producing an overabundance of a certain type of snail that feeds on the algae, and through that producing an overabundance of this parasitic worm, which in one stage of its life cycle feeds on the snail, and in another stage of its life cycle attaches to tadpoles, causing wounds on the tadpole that cause them to be deformed when they undergo metamorphosis. Whole chain right there. This study, a lot of these authors are associated with the University of Illinois or work here. I don't know if you know any of them. But this study also connected different agricultural chemicals to this infection by the trematode worms. But in this case, different things. Phosphates, also used as fertilizers, and a herbicide. Surprisingly, you might think a herbicide wouldn't have any effect on animals, but one that has received a lot of attention for all of its harmful effects is atrazine. And these authors showed quite clearly that atrazine correlates with increased trematode infection in tadpoles. Atrazine doesn't just cause problems with trematodes. It can also produce other problems. Something that has received a fair amount of press is the effect it has on frog hormones. Yeah? A couple of studies by a fellow called Tyrone Hayes looking at this. Again, so here is atrazine use, and of course, again, Illinois is right in the thick of that, just like the nitrates. Here, by the way, is the range of one of the leopard frogs that have been most affected by these issues, which overlaps it quite a bit. I think it's worth taking a moment to explain this graph. Can you read that? Okay. This traces atrazine levels down the Mississippi, right? And these are the levels, okay? This line right here. The census is done every other month, February, April, June. Got it? Okay. This column marked with red horizontal bars is the breeding season of the frogs in every given area. This bar right here is the legal maximum according to the EPA. I'm imagining that may have gone up in recent years, but last 2 years, but I don't know if that's still where it is. And this line here, according to this author, is the level at which frogs start to have problems with sex change, with atrazine. So all of that is to say that atrazine permeates the entire Mississippi drainage at levels that, according to Mr. Hayes, are a bit way, way beyond even his estimates, ones that would cause hormonal problems for frogs. So it feminizes frogs, and that reduces their breeding success, right? So it leads to long-term declines. Another study questioned whether that red line is actually right there. The other estimates put it much higher. But all the same, this is another study with a number of authors affiliated with this university. In any case, studies on this particular species looked at museum collections dating from 1852 to 2001, and they found that they can tell if the frogs are intersex, as they call them. And they found that patterns of intersex or frequency of intersex frogs correlates both with declines, known declines in frogs, and also chemical use patterns in this state, right? So for example, they spike when DDT was being used heavily in agricultural areas. They spike when PCBs and other chemicals were being used as Chicago became industrialized. And there is a very strong pattern of declines that coincide with use of chemicals and subsequent legislation that restricts them. Okay, we've got to keep moving. I know we could talk for a long time about any of these issues, but we have to keep moving. I'm going to move on to disease and microorganisms. I'm going to mention 3 as quick as I can. One disease that has been implicated in amphibian declines is ranavirus. It has particularly been a problem in Europe, some parts of North America. Until quite recently, it was not known to occur in either of our 2 areas. It was not known to occur in Illinois or in Costa Rica. But fairly recent studies, these 2 documented, well, these 3 really documented their presence. It's not really known if this virus could have been a player in declines, but this study in particular makes clear how easily it could have happened without anyone noticing. They were they found a few dead tadpoles in a pond one day, and collected them. And they turned out to be positive for ranavirus. And they went back less than 36 hours later, and there wasn't a single tadpole. There had been hundreds in the whole pond. There was no longer a single tadpole of multiple species in that pond. Right? Now, if they hadn't happened to collect a handful and gone back 36 hours later, they wouldn't have known that the likely culprit was ranavirus. So how many times has that happened here or in Costa Rica? Don't really know the answer to that. In general, it's been considered a temperate zone disease, not so much a tropical one. A disease that's received tons of attention is a type of fungus, a chytrid fungus with this long name. This was first described from frogs in Costa Rica, frogs that crashed at a site different to Monteverde. They're further south and in a different year. Work done on it since then has showed that it fits the profile of our killer profile, or the FBI profile, whatever we would call it, quite closely in a lot of ways. First of all, it's aquatic. Yeah? The spores float in water, attaching to the skin of frogs, feeding on the protein of frogs, reproducing incredibly fast. The spores swim out and reinfect the same frogs once they're infected, speeding up the infection rate, and impede functions across its skin and other problems, causing the frog to die of a heart attack in many cases within a couple of weeks. It's sort of like a frog Ebola, if you like. Yeah? The fact that it's aquatic might explain why the highland declines took place in stream areas in particular. The fact that it's quick acting would fit well also. And it also seems to have a particular temperature preference. It doesn't like the warm. And specifically, above about 25 degrees, I'm sorry, you're going to have to do the math, it starts to have trouble. Well, coincidentally, it's as you get into the lowlands of Costa Rica that you start to encounter those temperatures. So one possible explanation for the highland pattern observed in the southern crashes is that it was caused by a fungus that does not do well in the warm lowlands. Yeah? Seeing all of this, a researcher called Karen Lips noticed that there was what you could interpret as a wave-like pattern in the declines. And she interpreted that as an epidemic that was moving through both the Americas and Australia. And she identified a place in Panama where frog populations were still intact and started to monitor that. And sure enough, in 2004, suddenly all the frogs died. And where they had tested negative for this fungal disease prior to that, they tested positive. Yeah? A lot of other evidence points to this being the proximate cause of at least some of the declines, some of the sudden declines. More recent work has identified the likely origin of this fungus. It's Korea. It seems to have moved around the world through human introduction, through the pet trade and other things. And then, once in different geographic areas, spread sometimes more slowly. Karen Lips and others have presented maps that suggest, this wave-like movement of this epidemic through some areas. This type of movement does not suggest it's moving naturally, not by humans' schizophrenic movements. And it's known that there are a number of ways that this fungus could move gradually through a region like that. For example, it can survive months in water. It can even survive hours on a dry bird feather, studies have shown. So all it would take is a heron or a turtle to walk from one pond to another to transmit this disease. Yeah? The frogs can transmit it among themselves too. This study showed that if a frog that's infected sits on a leaf and another one then that isn't sits on the same leaf, it can pick up the chytrid fungus. Here's a big summary of chytrid fungus knowledge that came out quite recently. And if you map it out across the world, you can see that it's a disease that has been implicated very heavily in some regions, right? Certainly Australia and Central and South America. Yeah. You can also see, interestingly, that the red line marks wiping out species, and you can see that it flattens off around 2006. Yeah, presumably because there's no longer as many naive populations, right, left to infect, right? There's still ones that are probably vulnerable to this disease, but it seems to, in some areas, have run its course. In this area, you can see relatively, this is not something that is thought to have affected populations as much. Now, I say relatively because there's still a lot of species right there. Do you see that? Still a lot of species. It has affected the populations significantly in western United States in particular. But here's a curious detail. This is something I discovered while preparing for this. These folks went back in museum collections from Illinois to look for chytrid. You can tell looking at the specimens if they had it or not. And the dark spots represent positive cases. And they found that it goes all the way back to, what's the earliest year? 1898 in Adams County, that one, okay? And then just a couple years later, 1892, 1902, there, and guess where? Champaign. So these are the two oldest records of chytrid fungus from the United States, which is curious. They found it was in less than 10% of the population for most of these decades, with a curious spike in the 1940s. It's not a new invasive epidemic that has wiped out populations, clearly. And it's been around a long time. So there's lots of questions that come out of that. Okay, and the third disease I'm going to mention for about 3 seconds, despite its severity, is a salamander version of chytrid fungus, which was discovered much more recently. Escaped from Asia, has had impact on European salamanders, and there's grave concern that it could jump the Atlantic and affect one of the world's really salamander hotspots, which is right here in the eastern United States. That would be another calamity for the species that have managed to survive all the other problems we looked at. There is some good news associated with the fungus, and that is some species seem to have some resilience. all of these, since the initial declines in the area I work in, have reappeared, have come back. It's worth remembering that even though species can go unnoticed for a long time, there's lots of reasons that it's easy to overlook frog populations. This is one that showed up on a distant mountain ridge where almost no one ever goes. Trails only cover a tiny fraction of pristine areas. I'm going to skip that. Here's another one that hadn't been seen since 1983, and which showed up in one of the most famous zipline tours in the Monteverde area, a place that's visited by about 80,000 people each year. And there's a whole population that we found right next to their main trail, right there, that hadn't been noticed in 30 years. So not only can they be in remote areas, they can also be right under our noses and not get noticed. So we've had a significant recovery, presumably because the frogs have developed some sort of a resistance. This is a study I was involved in where we looked at fungus loads on different frogs, and we found that a lot of frogs carry high loads of this fungus. Some carry none of it at all, and therefore suspect that some frogs are resilient to the fungus and other frogs just manage to get rid of it. So in different ways, there have been some lucky survivors. And a very interesting area of research now is looking at traits that might help frogs survive, which range from behavioral traits, like sitting in sunny spots to cook the fungus off, to different microscopic organisms that they have in their skin, the ones we mentioned earlier. Okay, and I'm going to finish with global warming, climate change of different sorts. So I mentioned El Nino right at the beginning. The golden toads disappeared in an El Nino year. You can debate how much this represents climate change, because El Nino is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for a long time. It might be getting worse due to climate change. Because it's not new, and because a lot of the declines have happened outside areas of El Nino influence, it doesn't look like a common denominator in declines. But there are papers like this one that show a correlation between Nino events and declines, particularly in the Americas. So it could be an addition. It certainly could be an additional stressor, yeah, that doesn't help, especially combined with the bigger problem of global climate change. Okay. Climate change, I'm not going to say any more about this slide than what's up there. But there's a few ways that climate change might affect frogs. One is, as the world warms, it's likely to change the geographic distribution of animals. There's lots of evidence it's already doing that. That can be latitudinal, things moving north to cooler regions. That would be the more relevant component of this in Illinois. Or for us, in a tropical mountain, our species are arranged in elevational belts like this. So for us, we would expect to see things moving up. And there's quite a large amount of data now from Monteverde, where I live, to show that that is happening already in birds, in bats, and in lizards. However, it's hard to apply that to the frog declines. There's no evidence they're moving up. It wasn't just the mountaintop ones that vanished. And it happens so fast that it's hard to imagine a mechanism in which climate change would cause such a massive, quick crash. But there's indirect ways that can work too. This is a much quoted paper by Alan Pounds, the herpetologist I worked for many years ago, who still resides in Monteverde, in which he and colleagues presented a correlation between climate change patterns and the decline of one big group of tropical frogs called Harlequin frogs. Yeah. I think, in the sake of time, Very simply, they propose that increased cloudiness due to climate change has narrowed temperature ranges in our region, reducing daytime highs and raising nighttime lows and creating a more favorable temperature range for fungal growth. How likely that is has been debated quite a lot in the literature. Here are a couple of papers that don't like that line of thought. For me personally, again, I have a tough time imagining how climate change can cause a massive decline across different life zones in our areas in 1 year, through changes in cloud cover. But there's no question that climate change can act in all kinds of complex ways, and there can be surely no doubt that it's going to affect frogs in different ways. Here's a study, just to give you some examples, that suggested that climate change might affect the depth of the leaf litter in the lowlands of Costa Rica because trees are producing less leaves as the climate warms, and what leaves do fall are decomposing more quickly, reducing the average leaf litter depth and possibly producing a long-term decline that has been observed in that region. Let's see, of the things we've mentioned, climate change can affect almost every single one of them. We saw how El Nino played with UV light to cause that problem. Mention another one, Cuban tree frogs, those Florida invasives, do particularly well after big storms because they can tolerate high levels of salt. So increased big climate events might contribute to Cuban tree frog invasions. It permeates almost every single thing that we've looked at. So, who's to blame? I think this map kind of sums it up a little bit. And that is, well, lots of things. Depends where you are, sometimes alone, sometimes in synergy, right? Here's an attempt at summarizing some of these things in enigmatic decline, which today we would take to mean chytrid fungus, overexploitation, reduced habitat. I mean, it's a mosaic, right, of different causes. I find this image just tremendously powerful and symbolic. It was captured last week. Not because I want to point the blame just simply at the politicians, even though, hasn't helped. Nor because I want it to symbolize just climate change. But I think that all of us have a bit of Greta Thunberg in us and a bit of Trump in us. We're all partly environmental activists and sinners, both. And ultimately, the person who, or the people who are to blame in this, of course, is all of us, right? Because in one way or another, we all contribute every single day to everything on this list, right? In what we eat, in the vehicles we drive, in our silence a lot of the time. And I think that ultimately this issue should be, like Greta Thunberg, a wake-up yell for us to be less complacent about the steady cumulative destruction that we are causing to our home, right? And to realize that whether it's in little everyday decisions or bigger ones, we all need to take responsibility for that in order to change things for the better.